couple, Sarah and Tom, had always loved going through old things. Whether it was antique furniture, forgotten books, or photo albums, they found comfort in history, in the feeling of a past long gone but still lingering in some forgotten corner of their home. They had a small house, cozy but full of clutter. Their living room, particularly, was filled with old knickknacks, picture frames, and an old desk that Tom had bought at an estate sale. The desk, which was stained from years of wear, had a drawer that was always half open, filled with dusty trinkets and forgotten objects. One item, however, had always caught their attention: a small box containing several old photographs. The box had been tucked away for years, forgotten among the other objects. One lazy afternoon, as Sarah dusted the house, she stumbled upon it again. She showed it to Tom. Her curiosity piqued and suggested they get the photos developed. Tom, usually indifferent to such things, agreed. They hadn't had the chance to get any physical photos printed in years, and it seemed like a fun way to spend a Saturday afternoon. The photos were a mystery, and that intrigued them both. They weren't familiar with the faces in the pictures, nor could they place the locations. The images were in black and white, slightly faded from time. The edges curled. Some of the photos seemed to have been taken decades ago, and others looked far more recent. The one thing that immediately stood out to Sarah was a figure, someone who was always in the background, lurking just out of focus. The person didn't appear in every image, but in the majority of them, the stranger was present, standing silently at the edge of the frame, or just behind a group of people. The images were mostly of everyday scenes: people walking in parks, a group gathered at a birthday party, a family sitting around a dinner table. Yet in every single one, there was that figure. Tom, initially dismissive of her observation, slowly began to agree as they both looked closer. The man, if it even was a man, had a haunting, almost unnatural presence. He never smiled, never made an expression. He simply stood there, his face obscured by shadows, his clothes mismatched and out of place with the rest of the scene. Sarah tried to make sense of it. Who was he? Why was he in all these pictures? And why was he always so far off, like a shadow, an outsider? They took the photos to a local photographer for developing, eager to get answers. The photographer, an elderly woman named Margaret, was puzzled by them. She mentioned that these types of things didn't happen very often. Sometimes people's photos would come out blurry or distorted by an odd technical malfunction, but the consistency of the figure was troubling. Still, she agreed to develop them and promised she'd call them when they were ready. A few days later, the call came. Sarah and Tom were at home when the phone rang, and Margaret's voice on the other end was urgent, almost shaky. "You need to come pick up the photos immediately. It's important," she said, before hanging up abruptly. That evening they drove to the photo shop, unease creeping over them both. When they arrived, the door was already locked, but Margaret opened it for them, her face pale. She led them to the counter where the photos were neatly stacked. They came out. "Strange," she whispered. "Something's wrong with them. Something I can't explain." Sarah glanced at the stack, but her eyes immediately went to the first photo, the one they had looked at so many times before. The man, or whatever he was, stood in the background of a park scene, his face more distinct now. His eyes seemed darker, almost hollow, and his posture unnervingly stiff. The more they looked at the photos, the more it seemed like he was getting closer. In one, he stood in the background, barely noticeable, as if he were just another person in the crowd. But by the third photo, he had moved into the foreground. His body was tilted toward the camera, as though he were watching them. Sarah shivered, and Tom's hand tightened around hers. The last photo, though, made their hearts stop. There he was, standing behind them, his face grinning. His features were more pronounced now, though they were still twisted in a way that made him look wrong. He was far too close, as if he had somehow crossed the threshold of the photo itself. Sarah and Tom's faces were reflected in the window of the car they had been sitting in, but the figure was right there. His eyes locked onto them with a sickening intensity. "Is that us?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Tom couldn't answer. He could only stare at the photo in disbelief. How had this stranger gotten so close? Why had he appeared in their lives? His mind raced, but no answers came. Margaret looked at them both, her expression grave. "There's something about that man," she said. "I think he's following you." The air in the shop grew heavy. Sarah felt a chill settle in her bones, the kind of chill that seemed to radiate from the pictures themselves. It wasn't just the photos anymore. It was something in the air, something they couldn't see but could feel, hanging around them like a storm waiting to break. Tom and Sarah left the shop without saying much. The silence between them was suffocating, and the images in their hands felt like a weight they couldn't bear. They drove home in a trance, neither of them speaking, but both feeling a growing sense of dread. That night, they tried to distract themselves by watching a movie, but neither could shake the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. Sarah kept looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone in the corner of her vision, lurking just out of sight. Tom, for his part, couldn't stop thinking about the last photo. The man's grin. There was something malevolent in it, something that made his blood run cold. He felt as if he were being watched, hunted by an unseen predator. At one point, Sarah decided to check the photographs again, to examine the details more closely. She turned on the light in their living room and spread the photos across the table, one by one. The first few still seemed like simple anomalies, something that could be explained away as a trick of the light or some optical illusion. But the closer she got to the later photos, the more she felt the air around her grow thick, like the walls were closing in. When she reached the final photo, the last one where the man was standing behind them, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. There was a reflection, a faint one, but it was there. In the glass of the window just behind the figure's face, she could make out the faint shape of her own reflection, but it wasn't right. Her reflection was slightly off, her face warped and twisted in a way that didn't match the calm expression she had been wearing. It was as if her reflection was smiling. Heart pounding, Sarah dropped the photo onto the table, her mind spinning. She looked up, her gaze darting around the room, expecting the man to be there, expecting him to be standing behind her, just like in the photo. But the room was empty. She shook her head, trying to push away the irrational fear, but it clung to her like a shadow. Tom came into the room moments later, his face pale. He had been in the kitchen, but he had felt it too. The silence, the strange feeling of being watched. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, "we need to get rid of these photos. We need to destroy them." Sarah didn't argue. She knew it was the only way. But as they reached for the stack of photos, something terrible happened. A breeze, cold and unnatural, swept through the room. The door to the hallway creaked open, and in the dim light, they both saw something they had missed before. The man was standing there, right in the doorway. The man standing in the doorway was no longer just a figure in the photographs. He was real. His face, once distant and shadowed, was now clearer, more tangible. His features, sharp and unnervingly symmetrical, seemed to catch the dim light in ways that didn't seem natural. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to look right through them, as if he could see their very souls. His grin was wide, unsettling, and it stretched far too far for a human mouth. It was a twisted, contorted smile that sent a cold, sharp shiver through Sarah's spine. She froze, unable to look away from his gaze, unable to breathe. Tom stepped back, his face drained of color. "No," he whispered, almost to himself. "This can't be real." His voice faltered, and he reached out instinctively, grabbing Sarah's hand in a vice-like grip. Neither of them dared to move, both paralyzed by the sight of the man standing there, his presence somehow larger than the doorway itself. It was as if he didn't belong to this world at all. The air around them grew still, heavy, like the quiet before a storm. The temperature dropped, and Sarah could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. There was an unnatural silence, the kind that feels wrong, like the world around them had stopped. The man didn't move. He simply stood there, watching them, his grin never faltering. It was as if time had stopped, and he was the only thing that remained. Tom took a tentative step forward, his voice shaking. "Who are you?" But no response came. The man didn't speak, didn't acknowledge their presence in any way. He simply stood there, his eyes following every movement they made. Then, in a blink, the man was gone, vanished. One moment, he had been standing there, filling the doorway with his unsettling presence, and the next, he was gone, as if he had never been there at all. Sarah and Tom exchanged a look, a mixture of disbelief and fear. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his heart racing. "Yes. But where did he go?" The silence that followed was deafening. The room seemed to close in on them, the walls pressing inward like a vice. They both looked around the room, half expecting to see him standing in another corner, waiting. But there was nothing, only the soft, almost imperceptible creak of the house settling. The air remained cold, but the man was nowhere to be seen. Tom rushed to the front door, throwing it open and scanning the yard beyond. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone. No footprints in the damp grass. No shadows lurking in the corners. The night was still and dark, as if the world had gone to sleep. He stepped back inside, closing the door with a soft click. "We need to leave," he said, his voice tense. Sarah looked at him, her face pale. "Leave? But where do we go? We can't just run from this." Tom ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "We can't stay here. It's not safe." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't make any difference. The man, whoever he was, had already made his presence known. No matter where they went, he would find them. He always had, after all. The photos, the growing sense of dread, the eerie feeling of being watched. It was all connected, all leading to this moment. "I don't think we can run," Sarah said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He's already here." The house was quiet again, but the silence was anything but comforting. It felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in, as if the very air had been poisoned. Sarah and Tom stood in the living room, both of them straining to hear anything that might indicate the man's return. But the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. For the next few days, the unease in their home only grew. They tried to go about their normal lives, but it was impossible to ignore the ever-present feeling of being watched. Even when they slept, they couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just beyond the edge of their vision, lurking in the dark, waiting. It was in the middle of the night when Sarah first noticed it. She woke suddenly, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up, her body covered in cold sweat. She lay there in the dark, her heart pounding in her chest, listening to the silence that surrounded her. But it wasn't the normal silence. This was different. This silence felt alive. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkened room. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. And then, just at the edge of her vision, she saw him. He was standing there, just outside the bedroom door, his face as expressionless as ever. His grin, however, was more pronounced now, stretching across his face like a grotesque mask. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, cold and empty. He wasn't moving, but he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to send a wave of terror crashing over Sarah. For a moment, she thought she might scream, but her throat was dry, her mouth parched. Her mind screamed at her to move, to get out of the room, but her body refused to respond. She was frozen, trapped in place, unable to tear her eyes away from the man who was standing there, watching her. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Sarah didn't know how long she lay there afterward, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring into the empty darkness. But when she finally gathered the strength to move, she turned to Tom, her voice hoarse. "Tom." He was in the room, right there. Tom didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his voice was soft and hesitant. "I know. I saw him too." They hadn't spoken about the man since the first night. They hadn't needed to. The fear had settled between them like a thick fog, unspoken but understood. They both knew something was terribly wrong, but nothing could have prepared them for what happened next. The next time they went through the photos, the images had changed. They weren't the same as before. The first few photos were still there, those odd, out-of-focus shots of the strange man standing in the background. But as they flipped through the stack, they noticed something that hadn't been there before. The man was closer now, much closer. He wasn't just lurking in the distance anymore. He was standing right next to the people in the photos. In one, he was just a few inches away from the woman in the image, his face now clearly visible, twisted into that same sickening grin. In another, he was standing so close to a child that it looked like he was almost holding her. But it was the last photo that made them both stop dead in their tracks. It was a photo of them. They hadn't taken it. It wasn't from any event or occasion they could remember. The photo showed Sarah and Tom standing in their living room, as if someone had captured a moment when they weren't paying attention. But the most horrifying part of the photo was the man standing behind them. His grin was wider than ever, his eyes gleaming with something that could only be described as malicious intent. He was standing so close to them that it seemed impossible for them not to have noticed. But they hadn't. They hadn't seen him until now, not until it was too late. Tom looked at Sarah, his face pale. This can't be happening. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, they heard it. A soft tap, tap, tap from behind them, echoing through the stillness of the room. They didn't turn around. They didn't need to. They knew he was there. And this time, he wasn't going to leave. They never left the house. It wasn't that they didn't want to, but the overwhelming sense of terror kept them rooted in place. It was as if the house had become an inescapable trap, a place where the man could always find them, no matter where they went. Each room felt alive with his presence. the air thick with an unsettling chill that seemed to cling to their skin. The more they tried to move, the more it felt like the walls themselves were pushing them back, forcing them to remain where they were. At night, the dreams began. Sarah would wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, her body trembling as if something unseen had been holding her down. The dreams were always the same. She was in a dark, suffocating space, alone, until the man appeared. He would stand in the shadows, his grin widening, his hollow eyes following her every move. His voice, though never spoken, echoed in her mind, his presence an oppressive force that trapped her in a never-ending loop of terror. Tom, too, was haunted by the man. The moments of sleep he managed to steal were filled with the same oppressive nightmares. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, the feeling of being watched so strong that it was as though the man were standing right beside him. It was a constant, gnawing fear, an overwhelming sense of helplessness that neither of them could escape. But then, one evening, something changed. It started when they found the old desk again, the one Tom had bought at the estate sale, the one that had always been there, tucked away in the corner of the living room. It had been months since they had even looked at it, but for some reason, that evening, they both felt drawn to it. They sat at the desk, staring at the drawer, unsure of why they felt compelled to open it. The drawer had always been slightly ajar, filled with forgotten trinkets and old scraps of paper. But tonight there was something different about it. A faint, almost imperceptible noise seemed to emanate from the drawer, a soft, scratching sound that sent shivers down their spines. Without speaking, they reached for the drawer simultaneously. Sarah's hand trembled as she pulled it open, revealing a small, leather-bound book. It was old, the cover cracked and worn, as though it had been touched by many hands over many years. Tom reached for the book, his fingers brushing against its surface. As he did, a jolt of electricity shot through him, a sharp, numbing sensation that made his heart race. "What is this?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," Tom replied, his voice tight with fear. He opened the book, and the first page was filled with strange symbols. Symbols they didn't recognize. They were intricate and swirling, written in a language that was foreign to them. But as he flipped through the pages, the writing seemed to shift. The word began to morph, changing, until they finally became clear. "To see what is not seen, one must first be unmade," he read aloud, his voice shaking. "To undo what has been done, one must give everything." The room seemed to shift as he read those words. The air grew heavier, more suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around them, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the entire house were alive, watching them, waiting. Sarah grabbed his arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Tom, do you feel that? What is happening?" Tom didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were glued to the page, and as he read further, a chill swept over him. The next words seemed to burn into his mind, each letter searing his thoughts. To break the cycle, one must confront what lies beyond the mirror. The words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over again. He could feel something deep within the house responding to them, as if the very foundations of the building were reacting to the incantation. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, moving unnaturally, as though they were alive. And then they saw it, the reflection. The man stood in the mirror, grinning as usual, his twisted smile wide and impossible. But something was different this time. His eyes were no longer hollow. They were filled with something far worse: hunger. His grin stretched even further, as if the reflection were pulling him closer to the real world. The glass rippled, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. Without thinking, Tom slammed the book shut. The movement caused the shadows to recede, the air to feel lighter, but the man's face still lingered in the mirror, staring at them with a look of pure, malevolent intent. Sarah stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What did we just do?" "I don't know," Tom replied, his mind spinning. "But we need to destroy this book, whatever it is. It's not worth the risk." But as he reached for the book again, a loud crack filled the air. It was the sound of glass shattering, the mirror behind them splintering into 1,000 shards, the image of the man breaking apart into a cloud of smoke. The room fell silent. For a brief moment it felt like everything had stopped, as if time itself had paused, holding its breath. Then, in a split second, the temperature dropped. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and the house seemed to groan in agony, as if it were being torn apart. Sarah screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the roaring wind. She grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him toward the door, but the house was no longer the same. The walls twisted and bent, the very structure of the building warping, shifting. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, and the door to the outside was nowhere to be found. The man's laugh, deep and guttural, echoed through the house. It was all around them, filling their minds, pushing them to the brink of madness. They were trapped. There was no escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The wind ceased. The walls stopped shifting. The house was still. The only sound was their heavy breathing, the pounding of their hearts in their ears. They looked around, disoriented, but the house was the same. The living room, the hallway, the windows. It was all just as it had been before, as if nothing had happened at all. The man was gone, but they both knew deep in their bones that it wasn't over. He was still there, watching, waiting. The photos, the mirror, the book, it all led to this moment. They had been chosen, whether they liked it or not, and no matter where they went, no matter how far they ran, the man would always find them. And so, with a final lingering glance at the mirror that no longer held his reflection, they turned and walked out of the house. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because they both knew that they had just escaped something far worse than they could have imagined. And whatever it was, whatever it wanted, they would never be free of it. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would never be able to outrun the man. Not now. Not ever.